Now back to our top story and the preferred battleground, apparently for both sides of politics, the economy. Tonight's guest is the Shadow Treasurer, Joe Hockey. He joined me just a short time ago from our Parliament House studio. Joe Hockey, thanks for being with us.
Good evening, Emma.
This morning, addressing a joint party room meeting, Tony Abbott made an extraordinary claim stating that this government is, quote, hopeless with the economy and that it can't be trusted with money. How is that true?
Well, you've just got to look at the record of Labor promises and Labor delivery. For example, this year they promised to have a $22 billion deficit. It's turned out that it's $37 billion. They are now borrowing over $100 million a day. They promised a $4.7 billion national broadband network. It's now over $42 billion. So when it comes to actually delivering on their words, the Labor Party fails the test.
What's wrong with borrowing money to fund essential public services?
Well, the problem is that the Labor Party is wasting money. And if you look at the history of what they've done over the last 4 years, from pink bats and school halls to sending $900 cheques to dead people, it is just a conga line of waste. And that's exactly where you need to make the hard decisions to get rid of that waste, to get the budget back to surplus, and I don't think they're capable of doing that.
Well, you'd stand alone on the international stage in that opinion because, of course, internationally recognised organisations and economists disagree with you. Of course, Australia now has a AAA credit rating from the 3 international agencies, the first time in the country's history. Unemployment is historically low, our debt and deficit levels are minuscule compared to the rest of the world, and our economy is still growing.
Well, the Prime Minister is often keen to say this is the Asian century. Then the Prime Minister should be comparing us to Asian economies. The fact is she keeps comparing us to some deteriorating economies in Western Europe and comparing us to the United States, which is in what seems to be an extended period of anemic growth.
Well, let's have a look at Japan, Joe Hockey. Let's have a look at Japan. The international comparison between Australia and Japan by the IMF in terms of net debt puts Japan at the moment at somewhere around 120, 130% of GDP and Australia at about 8%. The
difference is that Japan can fund its debt domestically because it's got a huge amount of domestic savings. In Australia, when the government goes to borrow money to fund its deficits, 70% of that money has to come from overseas. Now, when the Australian government is in the markets borrowing in competition with our banks, it actually pushes up the interest rates that the banks have to pay, and therefore the banks pass it on to small business borrowers and home borrowers. And that's why under Labor, interest rates on average are higher, about 0.25% higher for home borrowers than they were under the Coalition, and for small business over 1.5% higher under Labor than they were under the Coalition. But economic conditions at the moment in Australia, you would have to concede, are better than if you agree with Euro money and with the World Bank and indeed the IMF, better than economic conditions virtually anywhere else in the world. Well, that's so those small businesses and other businesses in Australia are actually benefiting from that. Well, that's not necessarily the case. How is that not the case? Because we are enjoying the best terms of trade in basically all of our history. And that's not down to the government? No, it's down to the good fortune of having iron ore and coal and natural gas that China in particular, but many other Asian nations that are developing, providing insatiable demand for. Emma, there are businesses that are doing it tough. If you walk down a strip shopping centre in the middle of Sydney or in the middle of Coolangatta or the middle of Melbourne, you will see a vast number of for lease signs. I don't think many Australians in many sectors think it's going okay. There are 1,000 jobs laid off in Australian Bank today. BHP has even laid off workers, let alone Westpac, ANZ, Ernst & Young and a range of others. We are seeing significant job losses, and last year, in the last 12 months, for the first time in 20 years, we saw no job growth in Australia. That's not a tick of approval for this government. And are you going to airbrush over the fact that there are international influences on Australia? Not at all. Not at all. But what we've said is that the government hasn't been careful with taxpayers' money. And quite frankly, if they had have been more careful with taxpayers' money, then we wouldn't be running the sorts of deficits that they're putting in place, and we would be better prepared, so far as you can be prepared, for what will be a volatile, perhaps 2 decades of economic activity around the world.
Of course, international observers say it was the right thing to do, as it was all over the world during the global financial crisis, to pour money into the economy and therefore borrow money to do so.
What we've said is that the Reserve Bank had the capacity to do more of the heavy lifting during the financial crisis. But because the government spent so much money and in fact wasted so much money, still providing stimulus into the economy 3 years after a single quarter of negative economic growth, what that did was it meant that the Reserve Bank, which could have gone further, didn't. And of course what we've seen is we're left with a Labor Party debt that is going to take, on Wayne Swan's terms, it's probably going to take a generation to repay.
But certainly nothing in the order of what we're seeing in the US, the UK, Japan, the euro area. But
that's where they started, Emma. Look, they started with 60% or 70% of GDP in debt. Where the Australian government started was with positive assets in the bank.
Yes, but they were during the good times. But that was during the good times. We've had the global economic crisis. We've had natural disasters, floods and cyclones. I mean, you can't discount those impacts on the Australian economy.
No, I don't discount them. But every government faces those sort of challenges. The question is how well the government prepares the nation for the next set of challenges. And that's what this government has been negligent in.
Now, in August last year, you told ABC Radio that the coalition in government would need to find something in the order of 50, 60 or $70 billion in spending cuts to deliver the kind of surplus commitment your party has made. So which is it? Is it 50, 60 or 70?
I can say to you, Emma, emphatically, there will be a complete release of all of our costings prior to the next election. So before people go to the ballot box, they will see our numbers. And we will show, yet again, how we will get Australia's economy back on track. We will not be short $1, not one zac, not one dime. We are going to make the numbers add up, and we will do so because if the government gets its house in order, then the Australian people will have more confidence and get on with the job of improving productivity and growing the economy.
Let's talk about confidence. Former Reserve Bank board member Warwick McKibbin says there's nothing really wrong with the underlying economy, that it's really a crisis of confidence. And there's been a lot of criticism of your side of politics for talking down the economy.
Well, Professor McKibbin agrees with us that the government has wasted too much money. It has let the deficit grow rather than contracting government expenditure. He has been a strong supporter of our position that this government's wasted money and that we have to get on with the job of paying down government debt, not increasing it the way the Labor Party is.
Warwick McKibbin says there is a, quote, nonsensical obsession with delivering a surplus on both sides of government, on both sides of the parliament.
Well, he has seen the waste. As a member of the Reserve Bank board, he has seen the waste. But I can say to you, he has been fully committed
You're not answering my question. My question is about the obsession with the surplus. Warwick McKibbin says it's nonsensical.
Well, it's nonsensical if you would take into account what the Labor Party has done. They've had absolute disregard for expenditure. But it is a very sensible goal because from our perspective, it's a handcuff on Labor's ability to waste money. We want the Labor Party to run a surplus. We really do. And we want them to do so to stop them wasting money. It's easy for them to keep adding to the tab. For example, in the last 12 months, they've imposed a flood levy on Australians for about $1.8 billion. And they said, look, we've got to live within our means. When they announced the carbon tax package, they increased the deficit by $2 billion and said, don't worry about it, we'll just increase the deficit. They are sending a confused message to the electorate about fiscal responsibility. That's the Labor Party way.
Running deficits isn't necessarily bad economic policy is it, if you're actually spending that money on essential services and on delivering a better lifestyle for people, lower tax rates, increased pensions?
Emma, if you're not running a surplus when you have the best terms of trade in your history, if you're not running a surplus when even under Labor you have 5.2% unemployment, if you're not running a surplus in those situations, when do you run a surplus?
Well, the government says, just like you do, that it will run a surplus next year. They've mapped out how they intend to achieve that. You've said you want to introduce paid parental leave at a cost of $6.3 billion over 2 years, that you want to deliver dental help through Medicare at around $4 billion a year. You're happy to announce where you want to give people things, but you're not particularly inclined to tell everyone where you want to cut things.
Well, before the last election, we provided extreme detail on $50 billion of cuts to pay for our spending commitments.
But that was then, and this is now.
That was more detail than any opposition has ever provided in the history of Australian politics. We will provide a similar level of detail before the next election. You will see how we will pay for our promises.
But you still say you want to deliver these kinds of offers to the Australian public, paid parental leave and dental under Medicare and so on. So why are you, on the one hand, prepared to give away some of your intentions and not those on the cutting side?
Well, paid parental leave goes to productivity, and this is the debate that sadly Australia is not having at the moment. We need to find ways to improve our productivity, and the best way to do that, one of the ways to do that, is to increase participation in the workforce. Now, one of the hidden figures in the current unemployment data is that the participation rate is falling. So people are walking away from looking for a job. Our paid parental leave scheme is actually going to be an incentive for people to continue to work, particularly those people that have skills and have studied and had significant investment from the community in their skills development. That is a productivity enhancing initiative. And where you improve productivity, you improve economic growth, you lower the unemployment rate, and the cycle of prosperity begins.
How do you increase participation in the automobile industry when your party wants to strip $500 billion from that sector?
Well, what we've said is that we are committed to the plan that was laid down by the coalition government in 2007. What is unsettling for the car manufacturing industry in Australia is inconsistent policy from government. And the inconsistency is on the Labor side. They promised a green car fund, you remember that, for about $1.3 billion, and then they cut $800 million out of it after the announcement. The government cut the LPG conversion scheme. And of course we had the classic cash for clunkers, which the government promised at the last election and failed to deliver. So what the car industry wants in Australia is stability and certainty. And I might add, the worst thing you can do is introduce a carbon tax, because for a car manufactured in Australia that it costs $11,990, under Labor with a carbon tax it'll cost $12,390, and certainly that's more expensive than competing imports.
Joe Hockey, thank you very much.
Thanks, Emma.
And a footnote there, of course, I did mean to say $500 million was the proposal to be stripped from car industry subsidies, not $500 billion.